Thank you, Chairman, and thank you very much to Green Foundation Ireland for the kind invitation today. In light of what the other speakers have already talked about, I thought that the kind of two principal themes that I would take would be to talk about our relationship with the environment, what I call, I suppose, for today's purposes, our own relationship with the environment, really. Of course, not just the people in this room who will maybe have a better sense than most of their relationships with the environment, but as a population, if you like, that might bring in an amendment like this. And secondly, about different kinds of constitutionalism. We've heard about our constitution and about other constitutions. I'd like to talk a little bit about how maybe a particular kind of constitutionalism or a particular understanding of our own constitution might help us with all of this. And there's a few other maybe things I'll maybe digress into. Digress is maybe the wrong word, but certainly just divert to like maybe some of the arguments against that inevitably we will hear about if there were to be a proposal. But so to start, I believe very strongly that there should be a proposal to amend the Constitution. But I think it is more than about just bringing our Constitution into line with other countries. I think it's much more than about that. I mean, that's part of it in the sense that if all of these other countries are doing that, why is that? What's the something, and really should we subscribe to it? What's really going on, in other words, when other countries are doing this? So we need to think about that and not just replicating what other countries are doing. So really, I think the question and any proposal and any referendum that will result is really ultimately about our relationship with the environment as a society, identifying that and understanding it. And I say ultimately because any amendment acknowledging the environment within the Constitution will, as we've heard, it'll either be expressly qualified or will be taken to be qualified by reference to other rights, etc. So really what matters is the effect we give any amendment on the ground. And asking really what the nature of our relationship with the environment is and how much we value it and whether we really recognize our dependence on it is really crucially important, because it really is more than just about another layer of legal protection. Really, but the opportunity or the proposal to amend the Constitution I see as being important in terms of the opportunity that it presents for us to examine our relationship with our environment and really to consider some crucial questions like whether all of the structures for environmental governance that we have now and the no end of legislation and regulation that we have, does that really reflect a really positive, healthy relationship with the environment, a respectful one, or perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, does it really disguise what's going on, or does it distract really from what's going on? Is it really no more than a kind of a command and control type relationship with the environment? And I think, so really have we not moved all that far from, if you like, that dominion that centuries ago we saw ourselves as having over the environment for various different reasons? Is it still deep-seated? So I think we need to really think about that in Ireland before we do very much. If we do decide that we have over time developed a truly different one, then of course I think at that stage it is appropriate to correct the record, so to speak, to correct the constitutional record. And so that's just maybe some context at the outset. I mean, in relation, I'm just going to divert briefly to maybe some arguments that might be made potentially against the proposal, because it's not difficult to imagine a number of them being made. And the first, of course, we've addressed this already, we've looked at it. How would a proposal to amend sit with the various rights in the Constitution, and where would the balance be struck? And as I'll explain, this is really one constitutional amendment proposal, I believe, doesn't have to involve that type of balancing exercise. There's the argument that constitutional references to the common good, does that provide sufficient cover? I don't believe that those references do. I've mentioned the no end of regulation that we have, and what that might or might not mean. And then there is the argument about the EU treaties, and we've already heard about that from Dr. Turner. And for me, really, that's the extent, and of course they do have a competence in relation to legislating and regulating in the environment. And to me, to the extent that we, and of course we transpose of all of that legislation, I don't really see us as doing any more than, in general terms, implementing regulation. That's really about a fundamentally different issue, fulfilling general EU obligations. And then there's the argument that there's the specific EU Charter on Fundamental Rights with a reference to the Constitution, the European Convention, which we've heard about, and there is the fact that the human rights bodies and institutions at global level increasingly are featuring the language of the environment into the human rights treaties and an integration of human rights and environment globally. So really, as regards these latter points, regarding environmental protection at a constitutional level being arguably catered for in Ireland by those EU and other wider international conventions and declarations, I think for me there's a certain irony prevailing in that to the extent, in other words, we would rely on those to say, no, we don't need a constitutional amendment. Because really, for the very most part, the reason those instruments feature or they're there in the first place is because they reflect constitutional traditions and legal principles and concepts common to a whole range of states, so that to the extent that we would feel it unnecessary in Ireland to recognise the environment or environmental rights in our constitution, specifically because of the place and status afforded the environment and environmental rights at EU and international planes, that somehow smacks of avoidance, of really leaving it to others and of not doing it ourselves, of really shirking responsibility. So I really just mentioned those scenarios and those potential constraints, if you like, because I have a concern that it might descend to that, and somebody else, I think it was Nuala Hearn, expressed a concern that it would really descend to that type of contentious scenario, and I don't think it should be, because I think that a proposal or a campaign regarding constitutional acknowledgement for the environment should not be really about trying to achieve a reconciliation, even in the wording or even in the course of a campaign, because I really think that or finding really a wording that's the optimally consistent wording or the optimally sort of perfect wording, because really any proposal and debate should recognise that we really have the mechanisms, well developed, well established mechanisms in place to achieve that reconciliation at the level of the individual project, environmental impact assessment, the planning process, environmental permitting, and so on. So I really would hope that that would not come into a contentious campaign, and that is something that would be recognised at the outset. So my hope for any referendum that there might be on a proposal is that we could avoid that kind of disputing and contesting as far as possible, that we could focus on really what we are trying to achieve, because as I say, we do have those mechanisms that I've mentioned. And I do recognise that, of course, what we say and how any proposal is framed and worded is closely connected, and we do really have to think, of course, about how we do frame any proposal, and there has been reference earlier to the various models that we might take, whether recognising the inherent value of the environment and almost giving it a type of legal personality within the Constitution, or an environmental rights-based approach, or a focus on a duty, or an express reference to intergenerational rights, any mix of those really. And they all really represent different emphasis and different approaches, and the particular language will be nuanced, and those nuances will mean different things. And I think there was reference earlier to the Constitutional Convention meeting regarding economic, social and cultural rights, and one of the contributors to that, I think, mentioned that we in opposing the introduction of those rights into the Constitution, that we need to look around corners. And I do agree with that, but my concern is that we will end up looking too much around corners, and that we do that kind of instinctively in our constitutional debates in Ireland. So we have a constitutionalism where we like to dispute, where we're kind of instinctively drawn to disputing in Ireland. And it's really the kind of dominant constitutionalism that we have. It's a rules-focused one. It's a normative, rules-based, rules-focused constitution where we really pit one provision against the other, and it's about judicial review, it's about constitutional interpretation, it's about original meaning, original intent, all of those kinds of things, which of course all have their place, but it remains the dominant and really the only type of constitutionalism that we have, only kind of meaning or understanding of our constitution. When we're trying to think about how will we change it or what will we put into it, that's really, we come to it from that place very much. And I mean, there are reasons for that in the sense that, it's very, very closely grounded in the coincidence of the emergence in the 50s and the 60s in the United States of a very much a rights-based constitutionalism that sort of emerged at the same time we were discovering our own constitution, and other things like how easily we lapse into sort of politicized and party politicized positions in relation to issues about in this country when we come to consider constitutional amendments. But even against that kind of a constitutionalism in Ireland, and it's hard to get away from, why would there not be cross-party or cross-society support for an appropriate proposal? What would possibly be wrong with something along the following lines? And I'm taking this from the German constitution that Roderick mentioned earlier this morning, where it says in Article 20a, mindful also of its responsibilities towards future generations, the state shall protect the natural basis of life by legislation and, in accordance with the law and justice, by executive and judicial action, all within the framework of the constitutional order. And of course, it's qualified, all within the framework of the constitutional order, in accordance with law and justice. But I think that's inevitable. The only K.C. Weir in his 1966 book, Modern Constitutions, when he looked to see, was there any constitution that ever had unqualified rights, fundamental personal rights, and the only one that he found was, and this is where there was absolute rights to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so on, absolutely unqualified, was the 1930s Russian constitution. So, you can take it that there will be qualification. So the German constitution, why would there be the least prospect of a proposal like that being defeated? And just before maybe looking at that a little bit more, I should say that I am particularly drawn really to that extract from it that refers to the natural basis of life. That kind of assumption in it, it doesn't even mention the environment. The natural basis of life. It doesn't almost have to, it's kind of taken. And there's that sentiment in it. And I'm drawn to it really because that part of it really echoes a very important statement that the International Court of Justice made back in 1996 when emphasizing the duties on states to protect their environments and areas beyond their jurisdictions. The court said the environment is not an abstraction but represents the living space, the quality of life and the very health of human beings, including generations unborn. The existence of the general obligation on states to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction and control respect the environment of other states or of areas beyond their control is now part of the corpus of international law relating to the environment. So that sentiment about really being the basis of life and not being an abstraction, and it's a nice, to me it's almost a nice compromise between, we talk about on the one hand the nature with its inherent value, reflecting that in the Constitution, or rights or duties as alternatives, but that seems to be a nice sort of, there's an element of middle ground about that, I think. So I asked, why would there possibly be any kind of objection to that? But on the other hand, I would be surprised if even a proposal as benignly phrased as that didn't give rise to disputing and generally looking around corners in Ireland, because is it inaccurate to say that the prevailing and generalised Irish attitude to the environment can be characterised by disconnection, ambivalence, short-termism, blindness to the long-term consequences of significant interventions in the environment in terms of what we allow to happen? And really much of what's occurred here over the past 40 or 50 years would really support that view. And there is, regrettably, still abroad a not insignificant degree of cynicism about environmental activism in Ireland, and of associating environmental activism with really being anti-development and anti-progress. And those attitudes do exist, and therefore what reason is there to believe that those forces would not make themselves felt in a campaign to amend the Constitution, either by affirmative opposition, if you like, and or by lack of engagement? So just a brief word on another kind of constitutionalism. And again, I really hope that there would be broad support for a proposal of the type that I have mentioned. I'm not sure. So I think it is really important for supporters to really position all of this debate about should we have a constitutional amendment, to kind of position it in a new kind of constitutionalism, or at least a new one for us, a different one. Where really the case for constitutional change, it's the question becomes, what are constitutions, or really what is Bunreacht na hÉireann, and what is it now? What is it now in 2014? And I have a written paper which will be put up on the website, but in it I suppose, talk about how I haven't, in the Convention on the Constitution, even in the resolution from the Dáil, back in the Constitutional Review Group in the 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't really I didn't discern any real kind of examination of that question. And what does the Constitution mean? I mean, back in the 1930s, it was this kind of contractarian compromise, of kind of different cultures and, I suppose, political histories and so on, and it had to be. But we now have a mature constitution. And in the paper, I draw attention to what Keith Whittington, who's a political scientist in Princeton, where he talks about how when constitutions mature really from that kind of early contractarian position, how they really become, if you like, basis for societies to kind of identify the real values that they have. And by the way, interestingly, the Constitutional Review Group, when I was looking at that, I did notice that back in 1997 that one of the three kind of new provisions that they recommended be inserted was the following: the inclusion into the Constitution of a duty on the state and public authorities, as far as practicable, to protect the environment, to follow sustainable development policies, and to preserve the special aspects of our heritage. They recommended, interestingly, that it be incorporated into Article 10, which is the provision of the Constitution that talks about the state owning mining and mineral rights and all of that. So it's kind of interesting that, it was still tied to that kind of view we have of, and just the fact that they were thinking about it in terms of Article 10, I think, tells something. But if we focus really on what is a constitution, what's our constitution, we won't always avoid disputes about what should or shouldn't go in, but I think we have a better basis for doing it. And so, as I say, Whittington talks about constitutions, mature ones, being the basis for collective promises. And so in this way, constitutions really become what he talks about as really a place where you can search for values. And he says that constitutions might be understood to primarily perform a kind of ideological and symbolic work. At minimum, they might remind an already united people of their higher ideals when they face future moments of temptation to deviate from those ideals. More substantially, they might remake the very people who adopt them. A people might help constitute itself as such precisely by making the promises embodied in the Constitution. And the placement of collective ideals and aspirations in a constitutional text may create a dynamic that eventually alters the political and legal understandings of what the nation's most basic commitments really are. So a proposal to make provision for environmental protection in the Constitution here could be approached on that sort of search for the collective promise. And hopefully we could do so without, contorting and agonizing over what is the right word. Because really it's not about where it sits with property rights. We've lost it. If we're thinking in those terms, we've already lost it. It's about, does it have its own place in the Constitution? And I've mentioned the mechanisms for achieving the balance, achieving the reconciliation are there in any event. So really, let's only do it for the right reasons is what I'm saying. I do recognize that pragmatically it will be positive to have it in there. But I think we need to think about, rather than put it in there casually, whether we would put it in for the right reasons, and does it really deserve, do we think as a people that it deserves to have a place? So while I favour constitutional recognition for the environment, I think we really need to ask ourselves and understand where again we're at with our relationship as a people with the environment. And just very finally, I meant to mention the Ecuadorian constitution just to illustrate a point that already has been made this morning, but I'd like to just emphasize it. It's that, we can do all of this, but really what matters is the value we give it on the ground, so to speak. I mean, the Ecuadorian constitution has been mentioned, and that makes provision for the environment in the way that has been described, the sort of nature having its inherent value, almost its own legal personality, And maybe still radical. Donna mentioned the cases from the States that the Sierra Club have, and they were taken on the back of a radical article at the time that Christopher Stone wrote in the Southern California Law Review called "Should Trees Have Standing?" It was a completely radical idea at the time, and maybe becoming less so now. But the point is that yes, we can look at the Ecuadorian constitution, but really, what is happening there? There's upset and in some places outrage in Ecuador at the moment that a huge oil and gas field under some rainforest was, despite government promises that it would be left pristine, the rainforest there would be left pristine. It seems that the government has been negotiating secretly to have those exploited and to confer rights on that. And we can look at the constitution of China and say it's more progressive than ours, because it's got environmental provision in there. But when you look in recent weeks at the images in relation to smog levels there, it doesn't really live up to the constitutional ideal. So in conclusion, that's why it all comes back to our constitution, our understanding of it, and our understanding of the environment. And really, constitutions mean different things to different people. In America, the constitution is venerated. Even today, in some parts of South and Latin America, constitutions are really held with disdain. So I think we need to remember those messages when we talk about what are constitutional protections. So very finally, those are just really my thoughts, some random thoughts, but I hope that it kind of fits together a little bit. And I would finally just like to mention the 21st of January 1919, when the First Dáil met here in the Mansion House. And one of the first things they did was that they discussed a provisional constitution. So we're in a building where very important constitutional developments have emerged out of, and hopefully that can happen again. Thank you very much.